Is Pappy Van Winkle about to lose to Michter's and WhistlePig and the upcoming auctions? We're about to find out. We're going to have a discussion with Joe Wilson on this week's The Fred Minnick Show. Giddy up.
The Fred Minnick Show is brought to you by 291 Colorado Whiskey, by Michter's, and by Heaven Hill Brands.
And joining the Fred Minnick Show, a friend of mine from across the pond, Joe Wilson with Whisky Auctioneer. How you doing, Joe? Good to see you.
Good to see you again. How are you?
So I'm fantastic. You know, we're going to talk a little bit about an auction that Whisky Auctioneer has coming up. We're going to taste a couple. We've got two old Fitzgeralds, one from 1967 and another Prime from 1972. Of course, that's the year that Stitzel-Weller sold to Norton Simon. So two historically significant bottles that we'll be tasting here. And, you know, this auction is from May 13th through May 20th, and it's loaded with private barrels. You can find more about it at the Whisky Auctioneer website. But tell us a little bit about some of the things that you've got your eye on in this auction that are pretty exciting.
Yeah, so the idea of the auction is to really tell the kind of grand story of private barrel selections and kind of how we got to the point we're at today, where obviously they're one of the most exciting and interesting parts of the industry. So we're going all the way back to the very early 20th century. We've got some bottles of Mount Vernon rye from Macy and Jenkins in New York. We've got bottlings from, Hillman Pure Foods in Kentucky, like from kind of the 1900s into 1910s, like really interesting pre-prohibition bottles. And then as we navigate forward in time, we get into that kind of mid 20th century period where you start to see the first kind of not so much private selections, but private bottlings by Stitzel-Weller and people like Maker's Mark and stuff like that. And then really that kind of turning point in the 1980s is where, the crux of the story, when you have people like Van Winkle and Kentucky Bourbon distillers coming onto the scene and offering these private bottlings for people. And obviously the headline bottle is the Corty Brothers Van Winkle from 1974, which, is an absolutely sensational bourbon and one that we're really excited to see in the auction again.
Those go for a lot of money. Of course, you've got, people come to you with bottles. How does that work? What's the process like? How do they get bottles to you, and what's like their, do they get full price, or like how does that all work for people when they bring bottles to you?
I mean, it's a really straightforward process. Obviously, we're based in Scotland, and the majority of the whiskey we deal with is Scotch. So people, they'll drop them off at the office, or we'll go and collect them. With American whiskey, it's slightly different. This auction has been curated from two private collections, both based in the US. So we had to have them shipped over on pallets. And it's a big operation. It takes a couple of months, and there's a lot of negotiations. Obviously, people, they can be quite nervous. In almost all scenarios, this is sometimes somebody's life work. Certainly, they're a labor of love and their pride of joy, and it's very hard to pack it up onto a pallet and stick it on a boat across the Atlantic, not knowing when and where it's going to end up. So, it's a big operation to get these over here, and it's something that is. Thankfully, I'm not too involved in the logistical side of it, but when the bottles get here, it's really, really exciting to see en masse so many important kind of artifacts from the history of American whiskey arrive all at one time, and to be able to curate a private sale, an exclusive sale from these is one of the most exciting parts of my job.
Yeah, and there's a lot of competitors out there right now. I mean, if someone has a collection of American whiskey, there's any number of places they can go, and Whisky Auctioneer keeps getting a lot of those collections, and that a lot of that's because like you've kind of made it your life's work to really get ingrained into American whiskey. And I've always been curious, like how do you obviously you're in Scotland where you have the richest whiskey history surrounding you, minus maybe Ireland, that goes back and forth, but how did you get into American whiskey? Where did that passion come from?
I think I've always found myself challenged by things that I don't fully understand. And, I'm fully open about the fact that when I started working with Whisky Auctioneer, I didn't know a huge amount of bourbon at all. And it was an area that I identified very quickly as one where there was huge growth and one where we needed to do more with the subject. So I took it on myself to learn as much about it. And, it's one of these, it's such a rich tapestry of history that the more you read about it, the more you get involved in it, the more you become curious about the spirit in your outside life and you start drinking it, the more ingrained in it you become. And it has become an important part of my job to be completely engrossed in American whiskey, writing about it, curating auctions about it. And, it's been a labor of love as well as my job for the last 5 years.
That's interesting. It's and I know I've read your the pieces you put together for the auction lots. You do a pretty good job of the collecting the history. And as someone who's done several books in the space and spent a lot of time in archives and everything, like I appreciate how you get real history versus like the distillers like marketing version. So I mean, it's exciting to see. I always get excited when someone takes history, very important, and like what you all do. Yes, you make money off of it, and yeah, there's bottle sales connected, and we're all watching to see how much a bottle is going to go for. But I mean, really, it is a tangible piece of history. American whiskey is, and that's one of my favorite parts of it. Now, when we look at like kind of like the trends in auctions, I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the trends you're seeing in American whiskey. I'm seeing the rise of like early WhistlePigs and Michter's bottles like outselling some of the Pappy Van Winkles. Are we at a point where the Pappy Van Winkle line is waning a little bit, you think, and losing a little ground in these larger auctions to some of these new brands that are being coveted so widely?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it was waning as much as the others are potentially catching up, to be honest. I think obviously we've gone from Pappy Van Winkle being incredibly rare and small batch releases to the kind of allocation getting slightly bigger in recent years. But when we first started to really make the differentiation between an old Pappy Van Winkle from the kind of old Commonwealth days and the more modern ones, we could even see in the auction that although we described one as being, Stitzel-Weller bourbon, one being Buffalo Trace bourbon, it took a while for certainly our customer base to kind of twig on to the differences. And it's only in the last kind of year, probably 2 or 3 years, where we've seen the price disparity in terms of the value and rarity of those. So I think certainly people are always going to want Pappy Van Winkle bottles, and even the most recent releases are going to get good prices. But I think when you look at the old Commonwealth bottles, the old family selection releases, the Corty brother ones, obviously the price is skyrocketing for them all the time. But you're right, there is an increasing interest in these Michter's bourbons, the old WhistlePigs. We don't get as often, but there's quite a few coming up in this auction next week. And people take. I think the thing I always say, the market's kind of awash with these modern brands, but all the brands have these tales of history that you can go down, these rabbit holes you can go down. And the more people, part of what we try to do, as you touched on earlier, is give people as much context about the bottles as we can so that they can inform their own opinions as to where the value comes from. And the more people learn about them, either through us or through other sources, the more interested they become in the kind of historic examples of these from the past. So, you might be collecting modern Four Roses single barrels, but the more you learn about them, because we're a European auction, we have great access to Four Roses that wasn't available in America in the 70s and 80s that went over to Japan and Europe. And all of a sudden there's this whole world of opportunity for you to explore American whiskey. So you're right that there are other brands certainly getting into that kind of stratospheric value area. But I think on whole, we're seeing the whole market on the rise.
And of course, this auction's about, in large part about private barrels. And I could make an argument that these private barrels was how bourbon was originally intended. The earliest true documentation that we have about a new charred oak barrel being used in an American whiskey. The real documentation is not from like, what you see on the Elijah Craig bottles where it's, Elijah Craig invented it from an accident in a barn fire. We don't really know where it came from, but the earliest evidence that we have is from a grocery store in the early 1800s requesting barrels that were charred from a distiller. And it is an interesting look into how American whiskey progressed. That was how bourbon was sold. They did not bottle it and sell it to packaged liquor stores. They sold it by the barrel to accounts, to taverns, to liquor stores. And that lasted well into the late 1800s. It wasn't really until the Bottled and Bond Act came out that we see bottling at distilleries being system wide and more popular. And of course, then it becomes a consumer protection effort from the federal government. But the history of private barrels, it's both fascinating and it's also the origin of bourbon. It is how bourbon is intended to be. It's like a distillery putting forth their very, very best, and in hoping it wins over somebody that they care about. So I'm excited about this. You guys got a lot of private barrels from the Van Winkles, but there's some other ones in there that I think are great. Julian or Pappy Van Winkle, this was how he made his mint on the industry. Was he made relationships with hotels, with grocery stores like Burgers and Hilton in the Hilton chain. I mean, he had a relationship with Connie Hilton, and he sold him Old Fitzgerald private barrels. So it is a fascinating history, and this auction is just filled with it, man. In addition to the Cordy bottles, there's anything that's really popping for you that you're really excited about?
So there's some Willett Family Estate. There's a bottling for Benili over in Japan, Benili import. That we've not had it in the auction before. We've had other selections by them, which have all been incredibly popular. So excited to see how that one does. I think it's rare for a Willett Family Estate in that it's got a vintage stated on the label as well. I can't actually recall what it is, but I think it's an early 80s vintage. So that one should be really exciting. As I said, the kind of those pre-prohibition bottlings are really exciting as well, because that's, as you just said, that's where all of this came from. Right. back in the 19th century, if you wanted to get some whiskey, you had to take your old jam jar or an old boot or something and just get it filled up straight from the grocery shop, directly from the cask. And when you look at the trajectory of bourbon through the post-repeal period, there's always been a kind of hankering back to that kind of period. The first barrel proof Old Wellers that came out in the kind of 1950s were a kind of homage to this kind of high strength whiskey that would come directly from the cask in these shops. And obviously Stitzel-Weller, as you said, were very active in giving away private bottlings for people, and we've got similar ones from Maker's Mark as well. And I think when you look at the big four distilling companies post-repeal and the way they kind of cornered the market, I think there's a degree, certainly when you look at bottles from the 50s and 60s, of a kind of stifling of creativity, because they had their customers, they had large output to make, and it was kind of what were at the time smaller producers like Maker's Mark and Stitzel-Weller that had to kind of think outside the box. And that's when you start to see people reaching out to kind of third-party clients to produce these private bottlings, and for that to have caught on into the 70s and really explode into the private selection programs that we have today, I think makes a really good story, which is why we've tried to build this auction around it.
Yeah, and this auction is built, is littered with Black Maple Hill from the Willett days. You've got you got the Gold Wax Hirsch, which I don't feel like Hirsch is like attainable. Like you still have to spend a little money to get it, but I don't think that will go for gaudy numbers like you will see with the Pappies, and I think Hirsch will be attainable for someone looking to get some value in there. I also think there's a bottle of Dowling. You got a 16-year-old Dowling. Anytime I see the Dowling label come up, I'm hunting it because of their connection to history. You know, they moved their distillery to Mexico and started Waterfill and Frazier down there in Juarez, Mexico, to create probably the worst bourbon ever made in that Mexican bourbon. And then after Prohibition, they tried to make a go at it here, and they kept getting stymied by the ATF. They got behind in their taxes and their Anchorage facility. There's just so many little behind the scenes stories on that particular distillery that just kind of crack me up. But I've actually never tasted their 16-year-old bourbon, and when that was bottled in the, I believe it was in the 1950s. It looks like, that would not be a bottle that 16-year-old bourbon in 1953 or even in the 1970s would not have been popular. Back then, old whiskey did not sell. So, I'm just going through the list here. And, you're loaded with the some Elmer T. Lee, got a lot of the Four Roses. Obviously the BTAC is well represented here. Contemporary Heaven Hill releases. You got an early McKenna. I mean, there's just a lot of bottles in here that you definitely want to chase. And here's one that I think could do really well, and it's going to that contemporary side, and that's the Kentucky Owl, the first batch of rye. I haven't seen those up on a lot of auctions, so I'll be very curious to see how that one does. But one of the best whiskeys I've ever tasted is that Kentucky Tavern from the 40s, and you got a bottle of that in there. I mean, so you guys are, in addition to the private barrels, you definitely have a lot of value in here that I think that can be very attractive.
Yeah, there's a lot in there. I think obviously the kind of through narrative of the auction is this private barrel thing, but with these two private collections, there was always going to be a lot of other bottles and a lot of other great bottles as well. So we didn't want to just limit it to one subject. On the Dowling one, we've got quite a few of the collector's item bottlings as well that Ben Ripey produced just before and after they sold Boulevard to Wild Turkey. So these are, really interesting bourbons and an interesting, to me, an interesting idea to refer to these as collector's item when you're really in that. I think these would have been turned out in the kind of mid 80s or something, when bourbon's really at that kind of nadir in popularity and people didn't really want it. And these are old vintages and big age statements, as you said, that people probably weren't that interested in. So to brand it as a collector's item, almost a kind of unusual concession to the idea that maybe people weren't going to want to drink these, but also an incredible piece of foresight now when you think back, because that's genuinely what these have become. But it's hard to imagine that was truly what they believed was going to happen with these back in the day.
I'm seeing in the catalog, you've got signatures from Dave Pickerel on a 14-year-old WhistlePig, and then Jimmy Russell signed a Russell's Reserve 101. Traditionally, in my experiences, people don't really care about the signature. Is that changing? Are they interested in having a signature on the bottle now?
Yeah, I think so. I was the same opinion as you for a long time. You'll quite often see signatures all over bottles of Scotch whiskey, and people, rightly, as someone consigning a bottle to an auction, you want us to highlight that something's signed. But I don't think with a lot of releases it makes a huge amount of difference. But when I think increasingly we're seeing a huge pool of investors kind of coming into the market, and there are kind of fine margins with these things. So if you can demonstrate that something has an extra kind of wrinkle of interest or history, then it becomes more interesting. But I think also the passage of time makes things become more valuable. So obviously Dave Pickerel no longer with us.
Yeah.
You've got things signed by the Russells. Eddie Russell's moved on. Sorry, is it Jimmy Russell's the current distiller, or is it Eddie?
Yeah. So Jimmy is the he's the distiller, master distiller emeritus. Basically, he's still master distiller, and Eddie's still master distiller. So they're co-master distillers. Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, the more people learn about these people, and the more engaged people become, I think the more value they place on the signatures. So
Yeah.
If like a generic bottle of bourbon signed by a small craft distiller somewhere in Ohio or something is probably still not going to move the needle particularly. But when we start to consider these big brands, like I've no doubt that a bottle of Pappy Van Winkle signed by Julian or even Preston would have significant extra allure to a certain group of buyers. Certainly not, maybe not someone who wants to put it on the shelf and then eventually drink it. But if you're buying something as an investment piece, which is kind of mixed at the moment, I think there are still, across the whole bourbon industry, that it's not priced so ridiculously as the kind of Scotch whiskey industry is, that things are priced out of drinking range just yet. So you still are getting
now, Joe, I think a lot of us would like to keep it that way. And I know, I know we're all a part of that equation for the price going up a little bit, but I mean, this even the subject of like talking about collectors, there's a part of me that, I think I'm not the biggest fan of somebody just buying a bunch of whiskey and sitting on it to sell it. I want people to enjoy it. It's what it's there for. And, usually when these people who amass these collections, they usually buy 2 bottles, so one to drink and then one to, part with later. That's at least been my experience with probably the people you're working with. But I hate it when someone just like, buying a bottle and sitting on it and not sharing it with friends. I don't know. It's always bothered me. And I guess it's because I share, and like my collection is probably worth 0 because 95% of my bottles are open, and the ones that aren't will probably be as soon as the other ones are not. They're empty. So,
I mean, it's the great debate, isn't it, that will rage on. But the one thing I always say is that you have to have, if you want to be able to have the experiences that auctions like ours can offer you as a drinker, you do need people to not drink everything straight away. The two bourbons that we're going to try today from the 1960s, so that's long before I was born. So if whoever had these at the time had drunk them and shared them with friends, that these are opportunities that we wouldn't have. So
that's a good way to look at it. They don't, but back then people weren't buying them to sell in 20 years. I think that's the difference. Today there's like actual investor funds and everything, but and if someone does want to part with a bottle, and everybody needs the money, I understand, people need money however they want, if they have a special bottle. Will you buy a single bottle or a pair of bottles, or does it have to be like an entire lot?
So we would never buy something directly from anybody. We'd consign it to the auction. So if somebody wants to sell a bottle, they can sell one or they can sell an entire collection. It's really up to them how they want to do it. Obviously, if you come to us with 200, 300 bottles and it's something unique and unusual, as it was with these 2 private collections, we can look to doing, an exclusive auction and really try and find a narrative and promote it and try and tell a story through it rather than just in the general monthly sale. But if it's not an issue if you want to sell one bottle or multiples. Everyone is welcome to be involved.
Got it. All right. Well, I think we got 2 whiskeys here to taste. Let's do it.
Cool. Where do you want to start?
Yeah. So you all sent me this nice little package here. I've got. Let's start in with the decanter in the 60s. Now, when it comes to decanters, like I have like the weights of empty decanters, and what they are full for. So, like it is. There's nothing more disappointing than when you get an empty decanter or a half full decanter.
Yeah. So
How do
this one was
you? What
actually
do
this
you
was
all have
actually
like a measurement for all the decanters?
yeah. So we have I say fortunately, but we've been in a position where we have received empty decanters in the post before because something's happened. So we do have a note of a general amount of weights for a decanter, and then what that should be when it has the whiskey in it. So everything will get. You'll be able to tell something's half empty just from touching it, to be honest. But we will always endeavour where possible to provide a weight of the decanter so that people can inform themselves before bidding as to what the kind of fill level of that would be. This decanter is actually it's not a porcelain decanter. It was a glass
Mm-hmm.
decanter with a big kind of ornate stopper in the top, similar to the Venetian decanter if you've seen that before from Old Fitzgerald.
Yeah, those were nice. Great
Yeah,
whiskey out of them too. And you could.
yeah,
The only problem with those, they had an incredible amount of evaporation, and that cork would be anytime I'd pop one, it would be so wet. So
yeah.
it's like these particular decanters, I don't think they have much life in them. So if you're gonna be, if you think you're gonna buy it and sit on it, I don't think it'll survive even in the best conditions. I would say drink it. Here I am doing the advocating for drinking your whiskey again.
I mean, they are tricky because they can be very fragile as well. They're often only secured by the bottled and bond strip or the export tax strip that's put on them. So
Yeah.
you can get a lot of movement in that cork that can cause kind of leakage, or certainly it can cause the cork to get quite saturated and spin around, and that can affect the whiskey. So you do have to be very careful with how you look after these.
So this is smelling lovely to me. It doesn't have any of that oxidation or corky kind of. If anything, it's like dried apricot. I get some fall, like has like some fall smells. Like you walk outside and you just smell the like leaves. It kind of has like a nice fall earthy smell. A little bit of hazelnut as well.
Yeah, it's very fresh, isn't it?
It is. On the palate, I'm looking at some molasses. Some molasses, real nice molasses now.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There's like a big sweetness to it. Obviously, your standard kind of caramelly notes that you would get with these kind of Old Fitzgerald, but it's I think this was bottled in 1967, so only kind of 2 years after the introduction of the Old Fitzgerald Prime brand, which was the kind of lower proof version of the Old Fitzgerald that Julian the First.
And they during that time frame, that was when vodka was on the rise, and all of these distillers were trying to change their product offerings to compete with what people wanted, and that was one of their stabs, was lowering proof, and it helped them, also gave them a little bit of a tax break. That's always nice. And during this time, Stitzel-Weller was going through union strike after union strike. They had so many issues in the mid 1960s, and that would be one of the big reasons why the Farnsleys sold their shares and eventually got the Van Winkles to sell. But when I taste this, I just think about my friends who are no longer with me, that I used to talk to that worked there then. All the stories they would tell me, so anytime I taste a little Stitzel-Weller from the 60s, I'm reminded of how they would the strikers would try and go into they would try the local government had some kind of tax. They had a tax dispute with Stitzel-Weller after the strikers. So they had all of these local issues going on, and Shively decided when Shively basically became incorporated and started as a city, they offered to all the distillers that they would basically be tax-free. Well, in the 60s, they introduced a tax, and Stitzel-Weller refused to pay it because they said they were grandfathered in to the deal they made in the 1930s. That didn't hold up. A judge ruled against Stitzel-Weller, and they had to pay their taxes. And so the local government would go into the offices and take everything that they could. They would take all the furniture. They would take everything. And so Stitzel-Weller started moving things into like the warehouses. The local government couldn't touch anything in the warehouses because it was a federally bonded and locked facility. So they didn't have any rights in a federal warehouse. So I don't know. I that's the kind of stuff, like, I taste this and I think about that, and just a little piece of history, you know. In terms of the flavor profile, it really does track like a traditional Stitzel-Weller. Caramel, molasses, not a whole lot of spice humming here, but it's very velvety on the tongue.
Yeah, and that's the great thing about trying vintage old bottles like this, is that connection to history, because there's always every single bottle of whiskey is historical in its own right, but when you get things that are from at this stage over half a century old, there are so many stories connected to that from the time, as you've just recounted. And obviously Stitzel-Weller being a closed distillery, like, you're drinking something that at the moment is never going to be replicated again in the future. Yeah. And that's what it comes back to. It's good that there are bottles like this that still exist from previous periods, because it's an experience that everybody deserves to try, no matter whether you were born at the time or 50 to 100 years down the line. So
yeah, absolutely. And it's and of course the Stitzel-Weller, that distillery ceased to operate in the 1990s, and while they use it as a barrel warehouse now for bullet, those pipes aren't churning out whiskey anymore, and the grains are different. The wood to age this was different. They had different beliefs in how whiskey was made. There were fewer computers. There were, Stitzel-Weller was famous for even like keeping chemists out. So this was a distillery that was very much ran like an independent restaurant. An independent restaurant that's 5-star. They've got their techniques, they got their people, whereas like a chain restaurant has everything down to a science. So definitely a taste of history. Thank you all for sending this. And now that we're going to go to the 7-year-old prime from 1972. Of course, this is a sad year for Stitzel-Weller. This is when they sold. It caught the Van Winkles a little off guard. They were not ready for this. It wasn't necessarily a hostile takeover or anything like that, but it was not a welcome move by the Van Winkles. They did not want to sell, but they basically, the other shareholders did, and they, times were lean and sales were not good for bourbon, so they did sell, but they kept the employees and they brought in some new talent there as well. So this was oh boy, wow, that smells amazing. This smells like pecan pie coming out of the oven, and then and like the pecan shells kind of like left over. You just like take those pecan shells and just smell them. It's got like a really pecan-y. This is gorgeous on the nose anyway.
Yeah, and it's because these are both examples of Old Fitzgerald Prime, and the first one was 6 years old and this one's 7 years old, but there's a real noticeable difference on the nose particularly, and the color. Like, this one's a lot darker. It's got a lot out of that wood and the extra year in the cask. Yeah,
this is, you haven't tasted yet, so I won't throw my notes at you, but these are night and day. I mean, there is this like dark chocolate, bittery kind of note here with some undertones of like caramel. Um, this is intense. This is really intense. Very complicated. Like if I were to taste these and didn't know they were both from the same distillery, I would be like, no way, these are the same distillery. These are so uniquely different.
I'm with you on the dark chocolate. It's got a real kind of, even the kind of mouthfeel, very, very smooth. There's a kind of luxuriousness to it. You didn't, the first one, there was a slight astringency to it, I would have said, whereas this one, incredibly drinkable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is, I kind of like, so, when this airs, this will air, like May 15th, 16th, something like that. And by the time this comes out, it'll be a different moment in time, obviously, but I'm going to the Derby tomorrow, and I'm feeling like this might be one of those bottles I just kind of slip in that, in that little pocket and smoke with a cigar as I'm watching the races. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, I mean, it couldn't be more poignant. Obviously, Stitzel-Weller opened on Derby Day, 1935. Yeah. So if ever there's a way to commemorate another year gone by, nearly 90th anniversary, I suppose, in a couple of years. But, you're right that the 1972 obviously is, it is a very important year in the kind of history of the distillery. And that this one is still labeled as Stitzel-Weller. So I think it might just be pre the sale going through when obviously they started to be labeled the Gold Fitzgerald Distillery. So one of the last of the Van Winkle era, which is, something probably even more poignant for your
this is it, and I believe the distiller of the time was Roy Hawes, and he was a bit of an interesting story there. So it was either him or Woodrow Wilson. They were really close in this time period, and Hawes was this guy he actually was homeless. Both of his parents were murdered, and he just kind of found himself at Stitzel-Weller, doing work, and he ended up, working under some really great people. And to many people's opinion, he was the greatest distiller of that era, and that was before people were like named as rock stars and in the whiskey business, and distillers did not get credit. The owners did. Pappy Van Winkle was not a distiller. He was the owner. And, Bill Samuels was not a distiller. He was the owner. This is also a little ode to a long forgotten distiller, whether it was Woodrow or Hawes. So, cheers to both of those fellas and the work they did. But, man, thanks for sending these. These are great examples of history and things to come in your auction. So, one of the things that I do on my shows, we usually talk music. I usually have a musician with me or an actor or someone and we talk talk some tunes. So, want to take this as a moment to find out, like, what do you listen to? What's your jam? What kind of music you like?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds cliched, but I'm into all sorts of things. My favorite band of all time are probably Beirut. I don't know if you've heard of them. Band from, I think, New Mexico. Just like really, really interesting kind of journey through the decades with them. They kind of started off, they had this kind of almost Balkan inspired sound. There's a lot of kind of trumpets and accordions and stuff in that, and they've kind of progressed over the years to be kind of a bit surfier, and there's a bit more of a sound of the kind of American West Coast in their music these days. Yeah. And I think about their first album just before I went off to university in 2007, so I've been kind of on my own journey of growing up alongside them as a band, so they've always been really special to me. In terms of musicians from my side of the pond, I just went to see James Blake at the weekend. I don't know if you
Nice.
know him. That was absolutely incredible. Obviously, he spends a lot of time in America, just with his friends in high places in the hip hop industry and stuff now. So it was great to see him touring back on kind of home shores. So that was also a kind of, I felt doubly poignant because it was this kind of liberating moment, because that was the first time I'd been to an indoor venue for a gig since all of our COVID restrictions and stuff had kind of gone away. So it felt really special to be in the presence of not only an exceptional musician and hearing songs that remind you of being out and about before all of that really kind of helped bring you back into it, because everybody's got a kind of different mindset now, having been locked up. I don't know what it's been like over where you are, but we've been kind of locked up and locked down for about 2 years with not a whole amount of stuff to go out and do. We've been able to entertain ourselves indoors a lot, but it helped to kind of help set your mind free a bit.
It depends on what part of America you live in. You go to Florida, I don't think they ever felt COVID was even there. It was just nothing ever really shut down. Everything just kept going. California, masks everywhere. Everybody, the streets were very different. Here in Kentucky, it's, I think it was right down the middle. Early on, there was pretty intense lockdown. I mean, there were sheriffs going and, arresting people for having COVID and, violating some kind of law that said they'd stay home or something. But there was, for the most part, people are back to normal. And now, and sadly, it just became politicized, and you can't really have an honest conversation with anyone about it, because someone's going to get upset because they're on that side of the fence or the other. And it's just like, I think what COVID did, in addition to taking a lot of lives and, putting us all through an incredibly stressful moment, it divided us even further as a people, in a lot of ways. And one of the things that I have seen bring people back together is whiskey. So the fact that whiskey events are getting back together, and, people are, sitting and drinking in bars again together all across the country, I think that's healthy. I think that's healthy for us all. So,
yeah, I mean, it's great to see. I mean, as much as it is bringing people together again now, I think whiskey, even when the lockdowns first started, they were great for bringing people together. And we did that tasting together about 2 years ago now with the Pat's Whiskey people, which was something that, we hadn't done as a company before. And the opportunities for kind of online tastings and things, I think it really helped not only bring people together, but keep people together through a difficult time. And where we are in Scotland just now, I think the rules have just been relaxed to the point where you can get up and move around in bars, and you can talk to strangers for the first time, because before you had to be segregated at your own table. You couldn't sit at the bar, and now everything is kind of getting back to normal. So I'm looking forward to getting out and having some whiskey with some people and starting to live our lives again.
Wow, that's crazy. Well, Joe, thanks for coming on and talking through the auction. I'm going to keep close eyes on it, kind of like see where things go, because I think we're at a point too where most of us are just watching. We can't afford to bid on anything, but it's as fun to watch as it is, to get the bottle if you have the money. But it's exciting to see, and I appreciate you coming on and talking through it, and also advocating for for keeping a bottle or two. Like, that changed my mind. The way you put it changed my mind a little bit. Like, that was a very convincing argument there to be made for saving it for future generations. So that's a good way to put it.
You've got kids, right? Save something special for them for their 18th at least, or 21st.
You know how kids are, though. They'll probably end up being vodka drinkers just to get back at me for something that I did, taking a baseball glove away or something. But that is a discussion for another time, my friend. But cheers. Thanks for coming on and hanging out with me. And good luck getting back out there. I think that's awesome. You're getting back out there. It's great.
That's it. Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's good to see you again.
All right, brother. Be safe out there.
Cheers.
Cheers.